courtroom buzzed with soft murmurs. Papers shuffled, chairs creaked. The air was stiff, as if everyone was holding their breath. Then the doors opened. A boy stepped in. He was 17, skinny, wearing an old black suit that didn't quite fit right. The sleeves were a little too short. His shoes looked polished, but they were worn down at the edges. He walked with careful steps, holding a brown folder tightly in his hands. People turned to look, a few eyebrows raised. Some whispered, "Who's that? Is he lost? Maybe a delivery boy?" But Jalen Prescott kept walking. His eyes were sharp, focused. He wasn't here to deliver papers. He wasn't lost. He knew exactly where he was going. He reached the front of the courtroom and stood still. "Name?" the bailiff asked. "Jalen Prescott. I'm here to represent Mr. Lamont Green." The bailiff paused. "You're representing the defendant?" "Yes, sir." More heads turned now. A few chuckles echoed from the back rows. Even Judge Harold Wexler, who had been flipping through some case notes, looked up and frowned. He pushed his glasses up his nose and stared at the boy in front of him. "You're what, 17?" the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor." "And you're here to represent someone in my courtroom?" "Yes, sir." Another chuckle came, this time louder. The judge didn't smile. He leaned back in his chair and shook his head slowly. "This isn't a high school debate, son. This is real court. You can't just walk in here like Perry Mason." "I'm not pretending," Jalen said quietly. "I have permission. I filed the paperwork. Lamont Green signed it, and so did the public defender's office. I'm acting as his legal voice today under pro per guidelines." Judge Wexler raised an eyebrow. "Pro per," he repeated. "You mean in propria persona? You studied that?" Jalen nodded. "I see." The judge sat forward. "Well, this is a first. 17 and full of courage. Or full of something else. I haven't decided yet." Laughter rippled again through the room. Jalen didn't flinch. "I'm not here to impress anyone," he said. "I'm here to keep my cousin from losing his home." Now the judge leaned in, watching Jalen more carefully. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Maybe surprise. Maybe curiosity. "This is a civil case regarding eviction," the judge said slowly. "Multiple tenants, multiple landlords, complex documentation. Do you even understand what's at stake?" Jalen opened his folder. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, court documents, copies of rental agreements, and printouts of city housing laws. "I understand enough," he said. "I studied the eviction notice. It's missing required clauses under the city's Tenant Protection Act. The notice didn't give enough time. It was also served improperly, left on the doorstep without witness or confirmation." A murmur ran through the courtroom again, but this time it wasn't laughter. It was surprise. The judge blinked. "You read all that?" Jalen nodded. "Yes, sir. I stayed up all night reading. I borrowed textbooks from the library and even emailed a few law students who helped me understand the terms." The judge looked at the bailiff. The bailiff gave a slow shrug. "Paperwork checks out. He filed it on time." The judge looked back at Jalen. He picked up his gavel. "Well," he said with a slow sigh, "let's see if this boy knows more law than the lawyers. Proceed." And just like that, the laughter stopped. The room went quiet. Jalen turned and looked toward Lamont, his cousin, sitting on the side bench in a faded hoodie, eyes wide with hope and fear. Jalen gave him a small nod. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was the voice for a man who had been silenced, and this courtroom had just become his battlefield. Jalen sat at the defense table. His palms were slightly sweaty, but he kept them steady. Across the room, the lawyers representing the landlords whispered to each other. One of them, a tall man in a gray suit named Mr. Connors, smirked as he looked at Jalen. "This won't take long," Connors mumbled to his assistant. We'll crush the kid before lunch. But Jalen wasn't here to play a game. He was here because his cousin, Lamont, had nowhere else to go. Lamont had taken care of Jalen like a big brother ever since Jalen's mom passed away. He worked long hours as a mechanic and still came home every night with a smile, making sure Jalen ate dinner, did his homework, and stayed off the streets. Now Lamont's home, the small apartment they shared, was being taken away, all because the building's new owners wanted to raise the rent and push everyone out. They didn't care that families lived there. They didn't care that children went to school nearby. All they saw was profit. When Lamont got the eviction notice, he didn't know what to do. The letter was full of legal words he couldn't understand. "We got 30 days, kid," Lamont had said, shaking his head. "Then we're out." But Jalen didn't accept that. He took the notice to the school library. He searched every word. He looked up eviction laws, city codes, and tenant rights. What he found shocked him. The eviction was illegal. "They can't do this," Jalen told Lamont. "They skipped steps. They broke rules." Lamont had laughed back then. "You gonna stop them, Jay?" Jalen stared at the eviction notice and whispered, "Yes." Back in the courtroom, Judge Wexler called the session to order. "Let's hear from the plaintiff," he said, nodding toward Mr. Connors. The lawyer stood and gave a slick presentation. He talked about property development, progress, and business strategy. He said the tenants had no right to stay once the lease was up. "These are standard procedures," he said. "The tenants were notified. We are within our rights." Jalen listened carefully, writing notes as Mr. Connors spoke. He didn't interrupt. He waited. When it was finally his turn, he stood slowly. The courtroom watched. "Your Honor," Jalen said, "may I present Exhibit A?" Judge Wexler raised an eyebrow. "You brought exhibits?" Jalen walked to the clerk's desk and handed over a copy of the eviction notice, highlighted and annotated. This notice was not delivered properly. According to city law, tenants must receive physical notice, either in person or via certified mail. Leaving a letter on a doorstep is not valid service. The judge looked down at the document. Jalen wasn't done. Also, the tenants were not given the full legal grace period. The law requires 60 days notice for renters who've been in the unit more than a year. My cousin has lived there for 5 years. He was given only 30. Now even Mr. Connors looked up. Jalen kept going. "There is more. The building is over 50 years old. That means it falls under historical tenant protection. Any major rent increase or eviction must be reviewed by the City Housing Board first." He held up another paper, a letter from the Housing Board. There is no record of such a review. Judge Wexler looked surprised. He adjusted his glasses and took a long breath. "Mr. Connors," he said, turning to the lawyer, "did your client get approval from the Housing Board?" Mr. Connors stuttered. We filed the paperwork." "But did you receive approval?" "Number not yet." "Then why did you send eviction notices?" Silence. Jalen stood still. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. He had come with the truth, and the truth was starting to shake the walls of that courtroom. Jalen sat down again, quietly. He didn't look around the courtroom. He didn't need the applause. This wasn't a performance. But something had changed. People who had laughed at him earlier were now watching him with new eyes. Some leaned forward. Others whispered, not with amusement, but with curiosity and surprise. The judge scribbled something in his notebook, then looked up. "Mr. Prescott," he said, "you mentioned historical protection. Can you provide the clause or law section you're referring to?" Jalen flipped through his folder and pulled out a page. "Yes, Your Honor. City Housing Code, Section 8.4, Paragraph C. It says that any residential building constructed before 1975 is subject to additional tenant protections, including approval by the Housing Board before any eviction due to renovation or development." He handed a printed page to the clerk. Judge Wexler read it carefully. Mr. Connors looked uncomfortable. His assistant leaned over and whispered, "We didn't check for that." "I can see that," Connors whispered back sharply. The judge leaned back again. "Well, Mr. Connors, it seems your case may have some serious holes. Do you have a response?" Mr. Connors stood, but his confidence was gone. We, we followed standard procedure, but we'll need to verify this historical clause." "That's fine," the judge said. "But you sent out notices and scheduled evictions without that verification. That's a problem." Jalen's heart thumped, but he kept his face calm. He glanced at Lamont. His cousin's eyes were wide. He mouthed the words, "You're doing it." Jalen nodded back. After a short recess, the judge called for witness statements. Jalen stood again. "I'd like to call Ms. Gloria Redding," he said. From the benches, an older woman rose. She walked slowly to the witness stand with the help of a cane. "State your name," the clerk said. "Gloria Redding. Do you promise to tell the truth?" "I do." Jalen approached the stand. "Ms. Redding," he began gently, "how long have you lived in the apartment building on 145th Street?" 32 years, she said proudly. "I raised my children there." "Were you served an eviction notice recently?" "Yes, just like everyone else." Jalen nodded. "Can you tell us how the notice was delivered?" "It was taped to my door. No envelope, no signature. Just there one morning. Scared me half to death." "Did anyone knock? Did anyone speak with you in person?" "Number, not a soul." Jalen looked at the judge. "This is one of 12 tenants who received notice the same way." Judge Wexler tapped his pen. Jalen turned back to the witness. "And what would happen to you if you're evicted, ma'am?" "I don't know. I have nowhere else to go. I'm retired. My husband passed last year. I can't afford rent anywhere else." Her voice cracked. The courtroom went quiet. Jalen thanked her and helped her back to her seat. Then he called 2 more tenants, both with similar stories, both who received notices illegally, both facing the same fear. By the end of the third testimony, even Mr. Connors didn't look smug anymore. He looked nervous. And Judge Wexler? He looked serious. Very serious. Jalen stood again, this time addressing the courtroom. "I may be 17. I may not have a degree, but I know when something is wrong." He pointed to the tenants. "These people built lives in those apartments. They raised families. They worked jobs. They paid rent. And now they're being tossed out without respect or fairness." He turned to the judge. "I didn't come here to play lawyer. I came here because I saw something unjust, and someone had to stand up." His voice was steady now, clear, loud. "I may not be wearing a fancy suit, but I brought the law. I brought the truth, and I believe that matters more." For a few seconds, no one said a word. Then quietly, someone clapped. Then another. Then the whole courtroom stood and clapped for Jalen. Judge Wexler didn't stop them. He just looked at the boy who had walked in alone and had now captured the entire room. The courtroom settled down, but the air felt different now. Heavier, more respectful. Jalen sat quietly, his notes in front of him, though he didn't need them as much anymore. His arguments had been made, clearly and calmly. His heart was still racing, but his voice had never shaken. Judge Wexler looked thoughtful. He had taken off his glasses and was rubbing his eyes. For a long moment, he didn't speak. He just looked at Jalen, not as a child, not as a joke, but as something unexpected, something powerful. He finally cleared his throat. "Mr. Connors," he said, turning to the plaintiff's table, "do you or your client have anything further to add?" Connors stood. "Your Honor, we maintain that we follow general procedures, but we acknowledge some of the oversights brought forward today. We request time to review the claims made and consider options for compromise." "Compromise?" Wexler asked. "Yes, perhaps a relocation allowance or extended stay for the tenants." Jalen stood slowly. Your Honor, I'd like to respond. Wexler nodded. Go ahead. Jalen took a breath. A relocation payment isn't enough. Not for these people. They don't want to move. They want to stay in their homes, where their children go to school, where they know the neighbors, where they feel safe. He paused. If this court allows these evictions to go forward without holding the landlords accountable, then it sends a message that laws don't matter unless you have money. The room stayed quiet. Even Mr. Connors had no reply. Judge Wexler leaned forward. Mr. Prescott, you've spoken well today, and with heart, but I need to be sure you understand what happens if I rule in your favor. Jalen nodded. I do. This ruling could delay development plans for over a year. It may also be challenged in higher court. I understand. You may be attacked in the media. Jalen looked the judge in the eyes. Then let them attack me, he said. But today, I spoke the truth. There was silence again. But this time, it wasn't awkward. It was deep, reflective. Judge Wexler finally stood and walked into his chambers without a word. 30 minutes passed. Jalen stayed seated, hands folded. Lamont came over and sat beside him. He didn't speak either. He just placed a hand on Jalen's shoulder. The tenants stayed too. They didn't leave, even when they could have. They waited for the boy who had stood for them. When the judge finally returned, the room grew still. He sat down and looked out across the room. This court has reviewed the testimony, evidence, and legal claims brought forward in today's hearing. And while it is unusual to have someone so young represent a case of this nature, the facts are the facts. He paused. Then he looked directly at Jalen. Mr. Prescott, your motion to dismiss the eviction notices based on improper procedure, lack of housing board approval, and unlawful service is hereby granted. The courtroom erupted. Cheers, tears, and clapping echoed through the chambers. Jalen sat frozen for a moment. Then he let out a breath he'd been holding for hours. Lamont grabbed him in a hug. You did it, Jay. You really did it. Ms. Redding cried softly in the back. A few people from the audience came over just to shake Jalen's hand. But the boy barely moved. He had come to defend one man, and he had saved an entire building full of families. Judge Wexler watched it all quietly. Then as people began to leave, he called out, Mr. Prescott. Jalen turned. Yes, Your Honor. Come here a moment. Jalen walked to the bench. The judge leaned down and looked at him with something close to a smile. You caught me off guard today, he said. I laughed when you walked in. I thought you were a joke. Jalen nodded. But I was wrong. Jalen said nothing. I've seen a lot of lawyers in my courtroom. Some loud, some clever, some full of tricks. But you walked in with truth, and that's rare. He took something from his desk, a small, leather-bound notebook. This belonged to my mentor. He gave it to me when I passed the bar. Said it helped him win his toughest case. I think you deserve it more than I do now. Jalen stared at it, stunned. I don't know what to say. Just promise me one thing, the judge said. What's that? That you'll come back someday, not as a boy pretending to be a lawyer, but as a lawyer who never forgot why he started. Jalen took the notebook with trembling hands. I promise. After the court emptied, Jalen stepped outside into the sun. For a second, the world felt quiet again. But that peace didn't last. As he walked down the courthouse steps with Lamont and Ms. Redding beside him, someone called out, Jalen! He turned. A woman with a camera rushed toward him, followed by a man holding a microphone. We're from Channel 8 News. You're Jalen Prescott, right? The teen who just defended the eviction case? Jalen froze. Yes? How did it feel to take on professional lawyers and win? More cameras were pointing now. People from the sidewalk began to gather. Jalen rubbed the back of his neck. I didn't think about winning, he said honestly. I thought about doing what was right. And how long did you prepare? A few weeks. I studied books, read court cases, talked to people. I asked for help. The reporter leaned closer. Do you want to become a lawyer one day? Jalen looked over at Lamont. His cousin smiled and gave him a small nod. Jalen turned back to the camera. Yes, I do that night. Jalen's story spread across the internet. Teen defends cousin in court and wins. Young hero saves families from eviction. Future lawyer shocks judge with knowledge of housing law. People from across the country commented, shared, and celebrated. Messages poured into his school's email. Teachers printed out news stories and taped them to classroom doors. Jalen couldn't believe it. He didn't care about fame. He wasn't looking for attention, but knowing that others now believed they could speak up, that mattered. One email stood out. It came from a woman named Lisa Brantley. She was the dean of admissions at a prestigious law school. Jalen, you don't know me, but I watched your court hearing today online. You reminded me why I went into law in the first place. When you're ready, this school would be honored to welcome you. Jalen read the message 3 times, heart pounding. Then he closed his laptop and stared out the window. He hadn't just fought a case. He had opened a door. 2 weeks later, a community meeting was held at the apartment building. Families gathered in the courtyard with folding chairs, kids running around and neighbors sharing homemade food. Lamont stood near the grill, flipping burgers. Ms. Redding was handing out lemonade. Jalen sat in the middle of it all. Hey, Lawyer Jay, someone called from across the yard. He laughed and waved. The nickname had stuck. The landlord never tried to push the tenants out again. In fact, the city began investigating other properties owned by the same group. Things were changing, slowly, but changing. Later that night, Jalen pulled out the leather notebook Judge Wexler had given him. Inside, he found the first page filled in the judge's neat handwriting. Remember, the law is only as strong as the people who dare to use it. Below that, there were blank pages. Jalen picked up a pen. He began writing. Epilogue, 2 years later. A banner stretched across the main hall of Franklin High School. Congratulations to our graduates. Among them stood Jalen Prescott, wearing a black cap and gown. When his name was called, the room erupted in cheers, not just from his classmates, but from teachers, neighbors, and even some city officials who had come to see him off. As he stepped off the stage with his diploma, Lamont grabbed him in a tight hug. You're something else, kid. Jalen grinned. You believed in me first. Outside, as families posed for photos, a man in a judge's robe walked up, Judge Harold Wexler. I told you to come back as a real lawyer, he said with a smile. And you're almost there. Jalen laughed. Almost. The judge handed him a small box. Inside was a pin shaped like the scales of justice. When you make it to law school, the judge said, wear this. I will, Jalen said, his voice soft. I promise. That evening, Jalen sat on the roof of the old apartment building, the city lights stretching out in front of him. He opened his notebook again, and on the first blank line after the judge's words, he wrote, I spoke. They listened. We stayed. Then he smiled and added, this is just the beginning.